So this is the part of the show where I usually ask you for money to support our show. Not going to do that this week. There are two important things happening in April that I need to bring to your attention. I'm sure we all remember hearing about the shit show that was the Mythicist Milwaukee Con, yeah? Well, some folks have organized a positive response to that con, and they need our support. The Brew City Benefit is going to be on April 7th. It's going to have all kinds of cool speakers, including me, who will be speaking about topics that, well, let's just say that Sargon of Akkad fans wouldn't be cheering about them. They're crowdfunding to raise money for the con, and I'm going to have the link to their Indiegogo in the show notes for this episode. When you get a second, please check it out and donate if you're able. It's super important that we have positive and inclusive conferences in our movement, and if you're able, I'm asking you to please support what they're trying to do. Get a ticket, and you'll automatically be entitled to hugs from me. And speaking of cons that are doing amazing and important things, the Secular Social Justice Convention is happening in April too. It's actually the same date as the Brew City Benefit, but in Washington, D.C. So I'm afraid I won't be able to go, but this is another convention that's doing work that is absolutely vital to our movement and to our society. I'll have a link for tickets in the show notes for this episode. I strongly encourage you to check out that conference too. Last, but certainly not least, I want to thank Jop and Fruit of Hoops for being new patrons this week. You both are indeed the hoopiest of fruits. Your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. This is the Atheist Manifesto. Hello, dear friends, and welcome to the Atheist Manifesto. I'm going to be frank. The topic we're talking about this week scares the shit out of me, and I'll tell you why. I am a person who has had very little grief to deal with in my life. My grandma on my dad's side died about a year after I met her, so it was sad, but we didn't have a close relationship for me to grieve the loss of. My grandpa on my mom's side died when I was like 5, when I was too young to understand what was going on. My dad died a little over a year ago. We were never close, so there was some grief there, but it wasn't the kind of grief that comes with losing someone close to you. The closest that I've ever come is a childhood friend of mine was killed in Iraq, and up until the time we were about 10 years old, we were super close. I was, at his house every weekend, and like sometimes for like a week at a time when we were kids, and we grew apart in high school, not because there were any fights or anything between us. It was just, we just kind of grew into different people. It wasn't a big deal, but I still loved the guy a lot. And I came home one day to find out that he had been killed in Iraq, and it was sad. And I grieved, the loss of our childhood memories, and the fact that we never would have the chance to catch up or anything like that. But the deep grief that comes with losing someone really close to you that you're very close to and has a very active role in your life is frankly something I have not dealt with. And it's something that I guess nobody's really ever equipped to deal with, but I feel like I'm even less equipped because I'm 33 years old and it's just not something I've run into in my life. And it's something that scares the hell out of me to think about because it's an inevitable part of life, right? But it is something that I think is important to talk about, especially as folks who don't believe that there's anything after this life. It's a cliche, but obviously I think it has a little bit of a heavier context for atheists because, we don't believe that there's anything after this. And so this life is all we get. And when people are gone, we're gone. And so I think that's a super important thing to talk about. And so to have this conversation, our dear friend Eli Bosnick is back. Welcome, friend.
Thanks for having me, Callie.
So it wasn't too long ago you lost your dad, yeah?
Yeah, this week is the 5th anniversary of his death.
Gotcha. So
so I thought it was no better time.
Yeah. So tell me about your dad. Let's learn about him.
My dad was an English teacher in Binghamton, New York. He was also a university professor and was very much the sort of center of my world, the bottom of the pyramid. I went through my life making jokes about and my mom will never forgive me for this, but I always used to make jokes like, when my mom dies, I'll be sad. But when my dad dies, I'll kill a bus full of school children. And that was always the joke because I couldn't fathom a world without him. And he passed away very suddenly. He and my mother were in Ireland on a trip together, and he had a brain aneurysm. We think he was a religious Jew, so they didn't do an autopsy, so we don't know. But he bench pressed 325 pounds 3 times, sat on the elliptical next to the machine, and was dead. And that's what we know. And it tore the sun out of the sky for everybody in his life, because my father was, in many ways, what I try to be, the very bottom of the pyramid, the very core of the existence of so many people he knew. And so life without him seemed impossible. And what I learned, and one of the reasons why you and I talked about me coming on, is how to grieve, or some tips for how to grieve as an atheist that I wish someone had told me at the time, that I sort of learned the hard way, how to navigate the grieving space when you don't believe in an afterlife. And I wanted to come on and I wanted to share them, not necessarily for those who are going through it right now, because they might be in a different place than I am, but so that people can look back on this episode or listen to this episode if something unfortunate happens to them. And again, it will happen to all of us, and that's an important part of recognizing this. They can look back on this and they can have a toolbox to pull from and don't feel quite so alone.
Yeah, well, and I mean, honestly, it's a thing for me too, because I mean, this is something that honestly sometimes it keeps me awake at night. Like I know it's going to happen to me, right? Obviously, it's inevitable, and like I am fucking shocked that I've made it 33 years of my life without it happening to me yet, right? Because most people have had it at least once, if not multiple times by my age. And I just, it scares the hell out of me, because I mean, you know, I've read books and I've, you know, seen things that people have said about, you know, how to grieve, but it's like, that all sounds great in theory, but like, I feel like internalizing those things involves the ability to think straight. And I feel like that's the first thing that goes out the fucking window when something that tragic happens, you know?
Yeah. And that's a big part of it, is you don't understand it until you've experienced it in a lot of ways. Like many things in life, that you just can't wrap your head around it until it happens to you. But the universality of the experience is a powerful, powerful thing to remember. 2 days after my father died, I was just lost. I was in Binghamton. I was using my mindfulness practice, which I'll talk about a little bit, and the usefulness of that. But I was really lost, and I was in pretty deep shock, pretty calm, because I've always been a problem solver. And so I reached out to the only person I could think of, which was Sam Harris. I emailed Sam Harris, author of, End of Faith and One of the Four Horsemen, and he emailed me back within 8 hours. Which was amazing and kind. And he said to me in part, and I can actually read the email if you give me a second to look it up.
Yeah.
And he said to me, because I said, I'm lost. I've lost my father. He was sort of the center of my world. I don't know how to move on feeling the way that I do. And he said, the first thing to understand is that everyone you meet has gone through this or will go through this, and how connected you are to your fellow human being by this pain. And that was mind-blowing to me. And something that you don't really think about a lot. But
right.
Everyone,
and it seems so obvious when someone says it, like, duh, fucking of course.
Yeah, exactly.
But,
and
yeah.
Revelations about death are, unfortunately, the purchase of the woo merchant and the nihilist at this point, right? The only people who talk to us about these things are people selling us crystals or, telling us about how dark and deep the latest Rick and Morty episode was. Right. So there's this disconnect, right? We don't have these conversations about death. And I think it's important that we do. I mean, one of the things that we don't talk about as atheists on a regular basis is the idea of like, the major failing of atheism, especially in the modern day, and I use the word failing very selectively, but the failing of atheism is that there is no replacement in atheism for the afterlife, right? For my mother and my grandmother and my family that are religious, my father is, for all intents and purposes, still alive. He's just ignoring them. Right?
Right.
Which is a ridiculous thing when you consider my father would get up at 2 a.m. to get my mother a Lime bar. But, the idea that he's sitting in some magical cloud place where he cannot or will not contact my mother would be, damnation for him. Or that he's sitting in damnation, which is obviously the other part that comes up a lot when you're grieving for people who didn't believe in God, or you're just grieving for the unsaved in an environment where you're surrounded by the saved.
Right.
But something that's very important to understand, as an atheist that's truly helped me, and I'm going to get a little what seems to be wooey here, but again, it's just because this has been the purchase of the woo, is that void that atheists talk about, that we so casually dismiss, is paradise. And that's hard to understand if you don't have a mindfulness practice, but anyone listening to this who does knows exactly what I mean, which is that if you have a mindfulness practice and you've spent some time quieting your mind, and you've quieted your mind for even a moment, you know what this so-called quote-unquote void is like. And you also know that the happiest moments of our lives, so the way into this thought pattern, if you don't meditate or you haven't tried it, and I recommend people do, but if you haven't, the way into this is, if anyone listening to this thinks of the happiest moment of their life, it was still filled with unsatisfactoriness, right? You were still, I mean, at my wedding, looking at my wife as she gave me her vows, right? I was like, is this running late? Like, what time is it?
Right.
Your mind is filled with the future and the past. The only time when one is truly anything present is in the void. And when we picture the void, when we say when you die, nothing happens, we're talking about that void. What people picture is a dark room that you're screaming in, right? No body, no hands, and you're just like trapped in the darkness screaming. Or, the thing which is very clever to introduce people to, it's just like before you were born.
Right.
But it fails to, the problem with it's just like before you were born is that fails to encompass the idea of what it is like as a lived experience to know no thought momentarily.
Yeah.
The joke I always make about this, and that I always talk about this, is that Christians promise everybody heaven. And the answer is they're right? Because the closest we'll ever get to heaven, the closest we'll ever get to paradise is nothingness, is the void. Right? Because that is truly the only time when you are present. And there's nothing more present than when you cease to exist, when you become a present thing in the universe. And I know that sounds super duper wooey, but it's just true. It will be the moment when your illusion that is existence falls away.
Well, yeah, and I don't necessarily think that sounds so wooey. I mean, like you said, that's just kind of been the purview of those folks. So that's really the only vocabulary we have to describe it. And the only time that we describe those experiences or that we hear those experiences described is by people who talk about things in those terms. But I have, to calm my anxiety and that kind of stuff, I have definitely spent some time learning meditation techniques. And while we're talking about shit that sounds silly, I'm not going to lie. One of the meditation techniques that I learned is something that Tuvok described in an episode of fucking Star Trek Voyager. You just imagine all of this unsettledness inside you as this storm cloud, and you do your best to just blow it away until nothing's left. And you're right. Sometimes it only lasts for a couple of seconds, but there are some times where I'm able to just let everything go and there's just nothing there. And it is, it's blissful, right?
Yeah, it is. And the best metaphor I've heard for it is stepping behind the waterfall. And the problem with mindfulness for a lot of people is that they imagine it's stopping the waterfall, right? They see the flow of their thoughts in the waterfall, and they think that meditation is like holding your hands up and somehow all the water stops pouring down, but it's not. It's just stepping behind the waterfall. And if anyone has ever been behind a waterfall, you know how peaceful it is,
yes,
how beautiful it is, especially in contrast to being under the waterfall and getting and that's all the skill of mindfulness is it's learning to temporarily duck behind the waterfall. And if you've ever done that, if you've ever had that experience, you know that the void is nothing to be feared. It's blissful, it's peaceful, it is your truest self. It is the only self that isn't illusory. And so I use that as a comfort. Just on the philosophical level, there's some practical things that I recommend, that I learned that I would recommend as well when it comes to grieving. The first one, and I can't believe I have to say this, but I learned it the hard way, is you'll have a grace period where you haven't been hit yet, and you need to take care of yourself and put structures in place for you to be destroyed. And one of those is obviously you need to get yourself into mental health care. No matter how you're feeling or what you're dealing with at the moment, you need to get yourself into mental health care so that you're being watched and taken care of by a doctor. And I didn't do that, right? And as a result of me not doing that, I got up to 285 pounds and took incredibly bad care of my body, started getting migraine headaches. My depression got really terrible. And like none of it was the morning I had heard I would feel. So I just countered it as like, I'm fat now. I eat Chinese food 4 times a day. Like, what am I going to do? That's just what happens, right? And I didn't realize that it was my way of grieving. And when I started to get care and woke myself up to the realizations that came with that, the fact that my father was incredibly physically fit and was exercising when he died. And so that gave me a very quitter attitude towards exercise and my own body and, sort of removed me from my own body, insisted on a life of the mind because I just couldn't stand to deal with the physical. That was something that a therapist helped me understand that I couldn't. And just on the note of therapy, something, and we were actually talking about this a little bit before the recording, is there is at this point, and it's going to sound a little harsh, there is at this point no excuse not to have a good therapist. There were probably times in history and in certain locations, and obviously in certain locations today, where people couldn't find therapists who understood queerness, who understood atheism, who understood being secular or specific issues. But, I work with young students at NYU twice a year now, and one of the things I always recommend is a therapist. And every single year I'm told, oh, well, you don't understand where I live. There isn't this. Where I come from, it isn't that. I can't afford this. And I just, I say, have you ever Googled free therapy? And the answer is always no. Always. I have never run into a student in now 4.5 years of teaching where someone's gone, yeah, no, I spent 10 minutes looking into this and came up with no results. They always go, I don't know, I'm just not in the place right now. And I go, oh, okay, so you let the arm be broken. It's just hanging there at your side broken. And they're like, yeah, no, it's hanging there at my side broken. But it hurts. And I'm like, yeah, it seems like it does. Get on Google for 10 minutes. And if you're in a good place, this is the other thing I tell people. When you're in a good place, find a doctor. The way that you have a GP and I have a city MD near me, like I know that's my city MD when I get the flu. I'm always fascinated that people don't have like their equivalent of a mental health city MD and how little time it will take for them to find one.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you've got insurance coverage, because so much insurance covers mental health stuff. Like, I mean, obviously there are going to be certain circumstances where you may not be able to afford it, but like, I think there are probably lots more folks who can and think they can't. Right. Because I mean, there's even like there's Talkspace online, which is not free, but like it's cheaper than a regular therapist. Like, yeah, I definitely think it's something like, and I that's one of the first things that I heard is always like as soon as something happens, call a therapist. Like, even if you don't feel like you need it. Cause I mean, it's, if we want to liken it to physical pain, like I remember there was one time I was working out and I dropped a 45-pound weight on my foot and it took an hour for it to start hurting. You know what I mean? That doesn't mean that I wasn't hurt and that I shouldn't expect it. You know what I mean?
Right. Exactly. And that you shouldn't have gone to the doctor, right? You weren't like, I don't know, that first hour was fine. It'll probably go away, right?
Right.
You go to the doctor because you need to go to the doctor. And, let's be really, really blunt about one of the causes of that. One of the absolute causes of that, like not going to the doctor, is a cultivated identity of illness, right? I mean, we all have the friend on Facebook who doesn't have enough spoons every single day, right? But doesn't get care for themselves, right? And that's because as part of the accepting, loving, wonderful mental health care culture, we have brought with that a little bit of the dregs of cultivated identity of illness, right? Just as we always have the friend who has the headache, or we always have the friend who has the bad back, right? It doesn't mean that back injuries aren't real. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't get our back injuries treated. It does, however, mean that we need to be careful that we don't fall into those traps, because as society gets better at taking care of us, we can become addicted to being taken care of instead of taking care of ourselves.
That's interesting.
And I think that applies to all mental health and not just when you're grieving. And, I will say that some of the pushback that I get on that is people will say, like, don't you understand that when you talk about like cultivated, illness as an identity or cultivated identity in general, that you're discouraging certain people from getting care. And that is true if you don't approach it in a healthy way, right? It is important for people with diabetes to take their medication. If you like candy, you don't have diabetes. And if telling someone who likes candy they don't have diabetes, like, makes it worse for diabetics, then we have a weird approach to how to care for ourselves, right? We mustn't wait for approval to get care.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's just, again, a grain of salt, my opinion, but I just think that one of the reasons that mental health care goes ignored, there's the thing that we all understand and accept, which is the stigma around mental illness, the stigma around, getting care. I'm not crazy. I don't want to be seen as a freak. I can't afford it. I don't have the time, right? There are all of those stops, right? And I think our culture has gotten much better about breaking out of those patterns, but one of the patterns that I think we don't talk about enough, especially in leftist or woke or accepting circles, whatever terms you want to use for us, is it also feels kind of good to be sick and stay sick, right? Just as like if you come in, and the example I always give to my students is, you can always ask a young person if they're tired and they'll say yes. If you ask anyone from ages like 15 to 25, like, are you tired? You look tired. They're like, oh my God, I'm so tired. You don't know. I slept 0 hours in the last 7 years. And you're like, okay, this person obviously slept fine, right? But they've used tired. Tired has become shorthand for, being emotionally exhausted or being weary or just wanting empathy. And so something that I think it's important in our community of people who do accept mental health care, who do understand the importance of it, is to understand that like getting active care that helps you, that makes a difference, is just as important as getting the care itself.
Right, I see what you're saying. So there's a comfort that comes with being in that position because, and I've had this conversation with other folks that, they say like, well, when things start to go right, you get scared, right? Because even bad known is still, it still gets comfortable in a way, and it's scary to try to actually get better because you're putting more at risk, because if you try and fail, you can end up in an even worse position than you ended up with before. So it's like, it's the cliche of like the devil you know versus the one you don't know, I guess.
Absolutely. Not just that, but like, again, there is a cultivated identity of being ill. And if that's a large part of how you relate to the people in your life, and I can only say this from experience, right? I'll speak to my own experience, right? A lot of my friends know about my depression, and all of my listeners know about my depression, and they know that I make depression jokes all the time. So when I'm having a really good month, right, and one of my friends who also has depression will make a "you get it" kind of joke, right? Like Eli gets it, right? Who wants to get shot in the face with a bear today, right? The kind of jokes that I make about my depression. If I can't identify with that in the moment, it feels almost snobby. It feels closed. It feels like I'm trying to be above someone who may not be where I am personally in my caretaking, to say, actually, I'm having a really great month, and that's something that's hard to learn. It's hard to get better if you feel like part of what makes you up is illness. And I say that, and I don't say that just apropos of nothing. I say that because it greatly relates to grieving. And one of the things that I know I did that I wish I hadn't is I defined myself by my grief for a very, very long time. I spent a tremendous amount of my time defining myself by my grief because it was safe. And anytime something went wrong, anytime I was sad, anytime I failed or was afraid of failure and therefore didn't try, I went back to my grief as an excuse, right? Instead of hammering away at the problem. And that's one of the things that I think was really core to me, is understanding that this is a healing process and that the goal of it is to heal.
Right? Gosh, yeah. I feel like I feel like that's so precarious though, because like you got to give yourself some space, right? Like,
Absolutely.
because sometimes the answer is like, well, yeah, that happened, and that's because I'm grieving. I'm in a weakened state right now, and that's okay. But like, if you lean on, like, you have to be able to lean on that somewhat, because you have to give yourself space, but you also have to be, trying to actively work your way. Like, how do you balance that?
I think it's to everyone's specific growth chart. I certainly don't think, and again, my thing was in the first month or two of my father passing away, I was fine, right? My dedication was to being fine. So all through the funeral, I was fine. The days after the funeral, I was fine. The month after the funeral, I was fine. I didn't allow myself to be not fine for months at a time. Right? Because my goal, I had set this perfect thing that like I wasn't going to grieve. I was going to be this perfect stoic who dealt with that and didn't grieve. And as a result, I didn't give myself the care I needed. And it took me far longer to do the processing when the time came, right? It took me years to process all those emotions bit by bit. One of my favorite acting teachers said something that I have kept literally forever. I tell people when they're depressed or they're upset all the time, but it's he gave it to me as acting advice, but I think it's just amazing life advice. He says, you can cry for about an hour and a half. You can cry for about an hour and a half, and then you're like, all right, I'm hungry. I want some ramen noodles.
Right.
I'm done crying. You can try not to cry for 40 years. You can spend 40 years holding back a cry. And so one of the pieces of advice I give to people that seems, again, very obvious, but was something that I absolutely wish someone was told me is let it out fully. Let it out fully and let yourself drain of it. It will refill, right? You'll constantly be pulled back under that ocean. But when you do get pulled under that ocean, if you're in the safe place to drown a little bit, right? Not if you're working at your job at Wendy's, but if you're not working at your job at Wendy's, if you're sitting at home and you're in a place to grieve, get pulled under. Get pulled all the way under for as long as it takes, because it will be remarkably shorter than you think. And this was the thing that surprised me the most and that I was sort of disgusted with the most is, and this is just true, is that your reaction to mourning will be ordinary. When I started talking about this, the joke I always made was like, yeah, when my mom dies, I'll be sad, but when my dad dies, I'll kill a school bus full of kids. And I found myself revolted at how quickly I was okay.
Yeah.
Right. I wish I'd known it at the time. So there's two things, right? And they work in contrast. They are contrary to each other. The first is that you will be okay far sooner than you think you are. And there's no telling anyone that. So, for those who aren't grieving now, just like keep it in mind. Remember when Eli told you you'll be okay way sooner than you think you will be. You can't imagine how much more okay you'll be in a month, in a year, even in a week, even tomorrow. How much better it will be when you wake up tomorrow. And this is advice I give people when they're going through breakups, but it's a universal rule of sad that sad doesn't last. It just can't last. It's a universal human experience. On the other side of that is the absolute revulsion that when we lose someone that important to us, that when someone who matters to us that much exits this world, and we need the sun to go out to commemorate it, right? We need the mountains to fall down, right? King Lear, there's that amazing moment, I would crack the sky. He wants to break the literal, heavens open to describe the mourning of his daughter. But it's important for us to recognize, just as that's a universal experience, so is that healing. And how quickly we will heal, as sad as it makes us and as horrifying as it can be, is an important thing for us to learn. How quickly you'll heal. And to know that that is a part of the process as well. Just as it is, to be sad and to be hurting and to get the care you need. Moving on and knowing that you will move on just as everyone does, that's a part of your humanity, is important. And it's important to forgive yourself for moving on. And it's something that I didn't do for a very long time, and I kept myself ill for fear of not loving my father enough.
Gosh. Yeah. Well, and I mean, of course, right? Because this is the most important person in the world. Like, you should be devastated forever.
Right. And that's genuinely how it feels, right? And when you first start to feel better, and it happens way sooner than you expect. You know, a week after my father died, when I was having lunch with friends and laughing and telling jokes, I was struck with horrifying guilt at the idea that a world without David Bosnick could have laughter in it. What a horrifying, grotesque thing. How little must I have cared to laugh in a world without him in it, right? The world needed to burn down. And I insisted on re-burning my world down every time I started to heal. And you don't need to do that. You can let yourself heal, and you can forgive yourself for feeling better, right? And again, it's a light switch, because sometimes you feel so bad you know you'll never feel better, and sometimes you feel better and you can't believe how terrible it is that you feel better. And this is the universal grieving process, and it's contradictory, and it's maddening, and it's universal. It will happen. It is as sure as anything.
And is that something you just work through with time? Is it something you have to think through, like to get past those feelings of guilt and shame for getting past it? Like, is it a matter of time, or like deliberately thinking it through, or like all of that put together? Or?
I saw tremendous amounts of help from therapy. I found I took future me's advice, and I found a really great therapist who worked these thoughts through for me. Because I was absolutely trapped in a loop. I was trapped in a loop of, I'll never feel better. I can't believe I feel better. I'll never feel better. I can't believe I feel better. And it was really unhealthy. It damaged my relationships. It damaged my mental health. It damaged my physical body, in ways that it had never damaged it before. I got really, really sick from I'm not meant to be that heavy, but I just was, because I was so mad and I was so done with the physical world that I just made myself really sick in ways that I'm still recovering from, right? It threw off medication balances, which then had to be corrected for a different weight. And, now I'm 205 pounds, but I'm pretty much still on medication for someone who's 285 pounds. And that was a whackness that, like, I didn't have to throw myself out of, but I did because I didn't get the proper care.
Wow. So, 5 years later, that's still...
Yeah. And the other thing is that's important, and people tell you this, and it's true, is it never gets all the way better. It's not like a breakup. It's not like a sad movie or a show. It never gets all the way better, but you learn to navigate the world as it is. And the world as it is becomes enough. The world as it is becomes okay. The world will never be as good as a world that had my father in it. That's just plain true. Every day that he's not around is a worse experience, not just for me, but for everyone in the whole world. But we learn to navigate. Right after he passed away, I wrote a poem, which I won't read my poetry on your show. I think that's too sophistry even for me. But
I don't know. I mean, if you're cool with it, I'd kind of like to hear it.
But one line from it is, I said that when he died, the sun disappeared from the sky. Right, it felt as though the sun disappeared from the sky, and this was actually a few years later. It was like the 3rd anniversary of his death, and I said that we've learned to move around in darkness, right? And that really is the feeling. The sun will always be gone, but you will learn to navigate the dark, and it's important to know that if it's happening to you now, but it's also important to know that for the future. Because you will experience it, and it's not something to be afraid of. It's like the dentist, right? It's just, everyone goes, and everyone hates it, and everyone makes it out okay. And you will make it out okay. As ordinary and as terrifying as making it out the other side of grief okay is, you will.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's the world that I live in now. Like, because anxiety is not a constant thing for me, but I go through spurts and stages, and it's a thing that I ruminate on a lot. Is that I've had so little of that in my life, and I feel like the longer I go without it, the less equipped I'm gonna be when it eventually happens. Because again, I know it's gonna, and then I just start thinking like it's gonna happen all at once. Like everyone I love is gonna die all at once, and nothing's ever gonna be okay again. And I'm like how can I even think that? Because I don't even know what the fuck this feels like. And so, my thing is like, going through that and knowing how terrible it was and like knowing it's going to be okay. Like, I feel like I'd, even after coming out on the other side of it, like, I just feel like I'd be in constant fear of it happening again and going through that cycle again. And I don't.
In my experience, it's actually the opposite. I've lost people since my father. But knowing what's going to happen on the other side, knowing that I do come out the other side of it, was an incredible comfort. And the level to which I was able to step into the role of a caretaker, the level to which I was able to step into the role of bottom of the pyramid, I credit largely to the fact that my father's death prepared me.
Gotcha.
Prepared me for that, prepared me to be a caretaker and to know that when these things happen, you will be okay. And you're right, until you experience it, it's terrifying because you imagine, one imagines, not you, Callie, but one imagines that they'll be the one who never gets over it, right? They'll be that one person who's never okay.
No, that is literally me.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And everyone's like, no, I'm the one. And again, I felt that about my father. I was like, when my father passes away, I will literally be the one. I'll be the human in human experience who's never okay again. Who thus spoke Zarathustra, and I just jump in front of a train because I will be the one who can't take it. And again, it is a hard realization that you, like everyone else, will be okay, and that doesn't mean you loved the person who passed any less. It doesn't make them any less important. That there doesn't need to be something magical about your grief for it to matter.
God, that's honestly, that's comforting. Like, that makes me feel better.
Yeah.
Gosh, I don't even know where to go from here. Are there other things that we haven't?
I touched on it a little at the beginning. I will say that, again, and I don't ever talk about mindfulness because nobody ever asks, but
I am asking you now. Let's hear about it.
A mindfulness practice is really good. When you are grieving, having a skill set to step behind the waterfall of grief was important. It was important for me to be able to function in the world. It was important for me to just have a break from those emotions and feelings. So if you don't currently have a mindful practice, develop one. It's easy. It's a 5,000-year-old toolbox that's very easy to use and doesn't require anything, and it's free. So it's pretty easy to sit down and start over again. There are great resources on that, and I'm certainly not all of them, but I'm willing to be one of them. So that is something that I recommend. Getting care for yourself. Establishing habits and knowing that grief will creep up in strange ways, that you need to keep and this is why I recommend a therapist, that keeping your eyes open for all forms of unhealthy habits will be something. Again, mine was eating Chinese food 5 times a day. Just literally, I just had 5 meals of the same Chinese food 5 times a day and never recognized it was part of grief. I was just hungrier than I'd ever been in my whole life all of the sudden. And it took me years to recognize what those habits were and how to help myself out of them. So developing those good habits is something that sounds trite, and it's the propensity of the woo merchant to tell us take a walk in the woods, meditate, take vitamins, but those are actually all really good ideas, right? They're not the idea, but they're all really good ideas. And for those, especially us in the secular community who tend to live a life of the mind, it's important to remember that your mind is not different from your body. Your knees are yours just as much as your brain or your sense of humor or your heart or your kindness are yours. And so you need to treat them with just as much kindness and preciousness as you treat any other part of the illusion that makes up your experience.
So do you have any specific resources you can recommend for that kind of thing?
Yeah. So when it comes to mindfulness, the 10% Happier book and app and the new book, Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics, are the best resources for me. If you're a super deep thinker and you want to dive right into the philosophy, there's a book which has the world's most trollish title, but is actually excellent. It's called Why Buddhism is True, and it's phenomenal. Despite its title, is the A to Z spelling out of mindfulness as a practice on a philosophical sort of metaphysical level. Into the idea of mindfulness as a practice, which I highly recommend. And Sam's book, Waking Up, is a really good start. Like all Sam Harris books, you can take the first 2 chapters and just push them ever gently to the side as he explains the history of meditation in Brechtian German circles with original translations, and then get into the practical stuff. But I really liked Waking Up as well. But practically, for someone who's like, I want to start meditating today, download the 10% Happier app and give it a shot, because they've got 5-minute videos and 5-minute meditations to start a practice.
Well, that's good stuff. Well, thank you for, I'm sure this has been comforting and helpful for a lot of people, but it's actually been genuinely helpful for me too, because I get spells sometimes because I'm a worrier, right? If I'm texting Celeste throughout the day and she's not responding, I'm wondering if she's laying dead in the living room floor. Like, my mind goes there. Like I'm that kind of worrier. And then there's just this gigantic sense of relief when she texts me back. And of course, she's just been sitting on the couch watching TV, not paying attention to her phone, because that's fucking what everybody does, right? Or like if she says she's going to be home at 5 p.m. and it gets to be like 5:15 and I haven't seen her, like my mind goes places like that. And so it's something like, I don't want to say it's something that I'm always constantly like 100% of the time worrying about, but it is something that looms large in my thinking, is like, what the hell am I going to do when this happens? And like, as a general overview, right? I'm like, everyone goes through this, and everyone I know who's gone through this has come out okay. And like, I have better social supports than a lot of people and more access to good medical and mental health care than most people. So like, I have the toolbox and I am probably going to be fine. But of course, like, our rational brain and our emotional brain like to argue with each other a lot, right? And that happens to me. And so it's actually been hugely helpful and comforting to me too. So I really appreciate the conversation. I appreciate you sharing this side of yourself with us. So thanks a lot for that.
Yeah. One of the hardest things to learn is that reality is a trainable illusion, right? That your brain could that you could train your brain to stop having those thoughts, that you could literally change the experience you have of the world, that it's practicable like the tuba, right? Is a terrifying realization that most people never confront, really.
Yeah, which, I mean, obviously has like really awesome and terrifying implications.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, it's good and bad. But thank you so much for having me, Callie. I really, really appreciate it. I hope it helped someone out there.
And that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto. We are a proud member of the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative. We're a group of trans podcasting badasses working to bring more trans voices into podcasting and other content creation. Search for the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative on Facebook for more info. You can find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto. You can email us at podcast@thegaytheistmanifesto.com. I'm on Twitter at GaytheistCallie. You can find the show on Twitter at The Gaytheists. If you want to support the show and the activism we do, you can head to patreon.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto and make a per episode donation as little as $1 per episode. You can also head over to iTunes and give us a 5-star review. That helps us to get moved up in the rankings and heard by more people. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things, and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.